At 21 and 19, two sisters had their names on the cover of one of the country's most important natural history books. This is the story of Harriet and Helena Scott, sisters in 1850s New South Wales who are obsessed with butterflies and insects. Harriet and Helena were the daughters of Harriet Callcott and Cambridge-educated lawyer and entomologist H.W. Scott. Their mother was quite the scandalous woman for the times, having two daughters out of wedlock while she was still a teen. This didn't seem to bother Alexander Walter Scott, who arrived in Sydney from England in 1829 and soon shacked up with Harriet Sr. The couple would have their first daughter, Harriet, in 1830 and their youngest, Helena, in 1832, though they remained unmarried until 1846. A.W. came from an influential family with connections to the worlds of science and the arts, with his sister's cousins including David Scott Mitchell, whose extensive collection would end up forming the Mitchell Library, which is now part of the New South Wales State Library, as well as women's rights activist Rose Scott. A.W. himself also eventually entered politics, becoming one of the first elected members of the Legislative Assembly, representing Northumberland and the Hunter. From when they were just little girls, H.W. encouraged his daughter's education in a time when that was not really the norm. This support led the girls to want to study science at Sydney University and follow in the footsteps of their father. However, 19th century sexism that banned women from attending university put a stop to that. Blocked from their dreams, the sisters took advantage of the extensive homeschooling their father provided and their home on Ash Island, literally an isolated patch of wilderness in the middle of the Hunter River, near Newcastle today. The sisters spent years exploring the island and other areas around the Illawarra and Sydney, collecting live specimens, documenting plants, and observing moth life cycles. Most importantly, they painted detailed landscape vignettes showcasing the insect's actual habitat, not just a decoration, but for scientific data they shared with their father. This led to the Australian Lepidoptera and Their Transformations. Please forgive my pronunciation there. It's not a word I use very often. Completed in 1851, with its first part being published in 1864. One of the most important natural history books of the 19th century. Harriet's and Helena's names were front and center on the cover alongside their fathers. As I mentioned at the start, Harriet and Helena were also only 21 and 19, respectively, when it was completed. Their work was even called out by a prominent naturalist, William Swanson, in the Sydney Morning Herald during his review of the Lepidoptera. And I'll quote him here directly because it's just a little bit easier. "The force of painting can no further go. Every tuft of hair in the caterpillar, the silken web of the cocoon, all the delicate and often intricate pencilings on the wings of a moth stand out with a prominence of relief which is perfectly impossible to reproduce by simple watercolors." Over the next few years, the sisters were booked and busy, lending their expertise and skills to other publications and selling their art for a little bit of extra money. They even became honorary members of the Entomological Society. Also, excuse my pronunciation there. On the personal front, Harriet spent time in Wollongong and became increasingly frustrated as a single woman seeking a career in colonial New South Wales. In a letter to her childhood friend and future curator of the Australian Museum, Edward Ramsay, she wrote about wanting to chase fame. "In some way or other, and if I were only a man, I might do it. But as I am a woman, I can't try, for I hold it wrong for a woman to hunt after notoriety. I ought to have been Harry Scott instead of Hattie Scott." Helena, meanwhile, married artist and navigator Dr. Edward Ford in 1864, and the newlyweds travelled to the Darling River, which Ford had been commissioned to survey. Although the environment was harsh, and they were travelling through lands that had claimed the lives of Wills and Burke only a few years earlier, Helena seemed to enjoy it, spending her time collecting specimens and painting. However, tragedy soon struck when the couple both got typhoid fever. Helena would get better while Edward would die on June 20th, 1866. Helena's art would eventually be published in a section of Reverend William Wool's book, Contribution to the Flora of Australia. By the end of the year, the sisters would also lose their mother, and their father found himself facing bankruptcy, leading to the loss of their home on Ash Island. Harriet and Helena moved to Sydney with their father and half-sister. To survive, they took on more and more commissions, eventually providing almost all the figures for the scientific works published in Sydney. They even designed Australia's first Christmas cards using native wildflowers in 1879. In 1882, Harriet married Dr. Cosby William Morgan, a longtime friend and widower, becoming the stepmother to 4 teenage girls, which limited her ability to work. Unfortunately, historians have suggested that the marriage was not particularly happy. The next year, the girls lost their last remaining parent, their father, who had been serving as chairman of the Australian Museum. Helena, a single woman, was left in a difficult financial situation, leading the sisters to sell their life's work and family collection, over 600 drawings, decades of notebooks and specimens, to the Australian Museum for £200, about 25,000 Australian dollars today. Though they had to part with so much, Helena did also convince the museum to help publish the remainder of the Lepidoptera material in their father's honour, which she wrote to a friend also helped her earn a little money to keep the wolf from the door. Helena died in 1907 at 77, while Helena died in 1910 at 78. The Australian Museum still holds her entire collection, every specimen, every notebook, every painted illustration. And as recently as 2023, the museum gave the Scott sisters their moment, exhibiting their work and even creating a travelling exhibit that went around the country. Though their names are still largely unknown, it is nice to think that nearly 120 years after their deaths, people across the country were able to view their works and kind of understand their story. A little bit late, but better than never, I suppose. Thanks for listening, and please don't forget to like and follow if you want, of course, and let me know if there are any other Australian stories or any other stories about forgotten women you want me to explore. I'll try and put some links to some of the Scott sisters' work below that you can download and view yourself. Thanks again.